Again.
I'm excited to be up here talking with you because our organizations do so much good work together, and I think this is going to be not only an insightful conversation but also an inspiring one, because we can talk every day about how important it is to think about data and how it informs our decisions. We also should think about what are the systemic issues that are at play and how can people basically get involved.
That's right, yeah, and we did want to start this presentation with a quote by I.W. Wells that we talked about, which is, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And that's really what we're trying to do with the data today, is to turn some light on what's happening and what are these inequities that persist in work and wealth and health. Great.
Yes.
So the first thing that you need to know in the data is that the Harris poll has been pulsing the American public for the last 176 weeks, through the pandemic, to the banking crisis, to where we're at today. And the thing that you need to know about the data is that we are not in a pandemic crisis anymore. We're actually in the state of a perma-crisis. And Lauren, if you don't know what a perma-crisis is,
what does that mean?
It is defined by the Collins Dictionary as a state of consistent and ongoing instability created by a series of catastrophic events. What you need to know about that is that it is amplified for BIPOC Americans. So when you look at this data, the blue and the peach lines, they show that COVID variants, BIPOC Americans are much more worried about that than white Americans at 58%. This is also our recent data from the weekend, and you see 61% of BIPOC Americans also worried about a job loss versus only 45% of white Americans. So you have to start questioning, why did those things exist in those ways? And what you see is, the fundamental question you have to start with is systemic racism. And actually what you see is 6 in 10 US adults do believe that there's systemic racism, but where the variance lies is on the color of your skin. So 84% of Black Americans believe that there's systemic racism, but only 58% of white Americans believe that. There's a 26% difference there. We also see generationally, people are much more likely, younger generations, people under 40, to believe that there's systemic racism versus older generations, boomers, for example, at 54%. So there's an acknowledgement point of view, but then there's also an outcome and accountability point of view, which is very important in this data. 84% of Black Americans agree that systemic racism is the cause of disparities, but only 65% of white Americans actually agree with that. And then the other thing you need to think about is 61% of Black Americans strongly agree that there should be something done about the disparities that systematic racism cause, but only 37% of white Americans believe that. So there is a compliancy issue happening with society around that. Just quickly to get into the state of work inequities, and then Lauren's going to also talk to us about what signals and signs do we see changing. The first thing that you need to know is that things have not changed, unfortunately. In the research that we do with Hugh State of Inequity, we see 79% of HR directors thinking that their industry is doing a good job and creating change and implementing these diversity initiatives. But 84% of employees say they've made no meaningful progress in creating a more equitable workforce for people of color. You also see the other big number here is 84% of all employees report that their company has not done anything meaningful in the mental or emotional health since June of 2020, meaning that there were conversations that were had post George Floyd, but those quickly have gone away. And you see the impact of that in the research around there is discrimination, wage gaps, and burnouts that is just rife and throughout the workplace. 1 in 3 Black and Asian Americans are experiencing discrimination in the workplace. 3 in 4 Black women say wage gaps are a problem in the US workforce. That's because Black women are still getting paid 67 cents on the dollar to white men. And this compounds into a series of burnout, right? So 6 in 10 Black women feel burnt out from their workplace. That's higher than all other populations that we track and look at. There's also another interesting number here where 38% of Black men feel even if they have discrimination in the workplace, that they're not allowed to talk about it and they don't come out about it. That's kind of the hard notes there. We do have to talk about AI. You can't talk about the future of work without AI. And what you do notice, and it's interesting, is BIPOC Americans are more likely to be testing it out than white Americans. So those who are familiar with ChatGPT, you see the numbers rise in their likelihood to test it out. So 69% of BIPOC Americans are testing it out. That's 11% more than white Americans. They believe it's going to be more effective for their work communications. They also believe that it's going to likely improve the world at 67% versus harm the world. They're 10% more optimistic than white Americans there. Interesting in this data is that 74% of white Americans lead in that the fact that they think AI should be monitored because that it could create more systematic inequalities and reflect racial bias. So whereas only 58% of Americans believe that there's racial systematic racism, they're saying with this tool they are concerned about it. So there's some interesting disparities there. And then what's the future of hope? People want to see policy, transparency, and intentional investment. They want to see, companies have equity policies. They want more education in the workplace. And then this blue line is Black Americans who want to see impact happen in the workplace, clear compensation structures, investment in minority talent, recruitment and talent. And white majorities of employees also agree with that. But I wanted to pause here and give Lauren a chance to talk about what are we seeing? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's so important to note some of the disparities because I think when someone is responding to a survey versus what they do in their workplace can sometimes be very different. And I think when we think about solutions and what we're seeing that is working, it is when organizations or brands or companies are focused on things like nuance and things like intersectionality and historical context. And I think it's so important. We're talking a lot right now about this compounding unearned privilege, this concept of, you get access to so much stuff just because of the color of your skin, or you don't get access to so many things because of the color of your skin. And so these institutions have this obligation to figure out that nuance, and it's hard. It is hard because there's so much complexity. And when we think about how people can thrive in the workplace, when we think about how people can thrive in these spaces that they're spending most of their time in, we have to think about the fact that equity means righting the wrongs of the past. And what that looks like, we're seeing this play out literally as we speak with the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. We're seeing how historical context, at best is being left out of some of these conversations, and at worst, we're repeating some of the same cycles. So this idea of making sure that we're understanding the complexities of people's identities and humanity is so important. The other thing is, speaking of politics, industries are not going to be able to shy away from conversations around things that are increasingly politicized. Things like access to water or the fact that people should just be able to exist in their full humanity are up for debate, which is incredibly disheartening. We're still talking in terms of binary terms of man, woman, black, white, red or blue, and it's so much more dynamic than that. And so brands, organizations, we do a lot of work with brands that have to cut through that noise, have a stance that aligns with their values and is one that's defensible, and sustainable. And then lastly, I absolutely use this slide to call out a couple of my friends that are doing incredible work. You had mentioned in some of the data, people are expecting these investments to still happen. We're seeing left and right where, diversity dollars are drying up, CSR dollars are drying up, and that absolutely cannot happen. We have to keep investing in the learning. People have to keep understanding how to remove that bias from their workplace or get out of the way, frankly.
Especially for Gen Z and millennials, the future workers who are all saying they acknowledge systemic racism exists. So there cannot be one without the other.
Exactly, 100%.
Great. So we'll get on to our next one, the state of wealth equities. The first thing to know here is that for all Americans, it's been tougher and more challenging and more pressures financially now in the inflationary time that we are in than during the pandemic. But it's especially hard for BIPOC and Black Americans. And this green line that you see here is those who have sought additional income. We see nearly half of BIPOC Americans have done that versus just 37% of white Americans. But also this pink line is those who are feeling vulnerable right now, who feel like they're gonna miss a bill payment or have missed a bill payment. That's 37% of Black Americans versus just 21% of white Americans, and that's a big 16% swing. And then we also see those who support a family member, which is something that is absolutely selfless, but also challenging and more burdensome, that BIPOC and Black Americans are doing that at substantial levels more than white Americans. But that's kind of the short term. The long term is there is a desire to build generational wealth, right? In the Black and Hispanic community, 83% are thinking long term about building generational wealth for their families. 83% want to do it differently than their parents, but they're facing financial advisors who don't relate to them, who don't understand them, and 62% say they cannot find a financial advisor that is relatable and can kind of give them that game plan to navigate the future. So with that, you see a big rise in BIPOC Americans, especially looking into alternative investments like cryptocurrency. And part of this is because the traditional banking system has treated them unfairly historically and for years, but continuously to this day. So this is recent data from this weekend that 44% of BIPOC Americans are still unfairly treated by the banking institutions and loan institutions. And that's why you see, even despite a challenging cryptocurrency market, they're much more likely to be invested in cryptocurrency, Black, Hispanic, and LGBTQ, and they feel like they're more fairly treated, and it's more of a legitimate form of payment than the white Americans' perception of cryptocurrency. The second to last point here is it's important because Black and Hispanic people give back to their community in time and resources, but important, the number here is 76% of Black and Hispanic Americans go out of their way to support Black-owned and minority-owned businesses. Only 44% of white Americans do that. So there's a difference in aligning values and wallets here, and what is allyship and accountability if you're not going out of your way to support Black and Hispanic businesses. The future hope here is both Black and white Americans are looking to businesses. This is a distinct change from November of 2022 when we looked at this information. You see a rise and desire for businesses to step up and create positive impact in communities. But where the positive impact is coming from is, if you look at the data on the right, corporations are all the way at the bottom. On the top is small businesses, NGOs, health entities, education entities. So I would like to pause there and give Lauryn a chance to talk about that and why do we see that and what's going on?
Yes, I mean, the first thing to kind of think about is this distinction between what's going on systemically and then what can we do kind of within our families, within our homes, within our communities and neighborhoods. I think you're absolutely right. At the systemic level, no one sector is going to save us, first and foremost. I just want to make that very clear. I think there's a lot of effort in the nonprofit sector to solve all of our problems, and the private sector sometimes gets off scot-free. And frankly, I think we should be thinking about how do we hold these sectors accountable for kind of commiserately to the harm that they have caused historically. So financial institutions, insurance institutions that literally built their wealth on the backs of Black people through slavery. Like, we have to be really honest about that. And so I used to work in fintech, and so I'm very critical of the financial services. Sorry for anyone in the audience who works in banking, but we have to think about what's going on at the systemic level. On the interpersonal kind of community level, I mean, I'm so impressed what's going on in where people are putting their investments. People are investing in Main Street in the same ways that we were seeing the investments in Silicon Valley years prior. We're seeing organizations like Lacey that are LA Clean Tech Incubator that is like hyper focused on climate. We see Slauson and Company, a hyper localized, amazing group of investors that are really building the companies of tomorrow. We're seeing LGBT VC that are hyper focusing on investing dollars in the communities that have never been, who have woefully been under capitalized, and Black VC, which are people trying to think about how to bring more Black folks into venture capital. And so when we think about capital deployment and what that means for business, it's so important. It's just as important as going into the store and paying for a product or service with your dollars. And then lastly, again, I love shouting out all of my friends. When it comes to kind of wealth building, I mean, that's something me and my fiance think about constantly, is like, how are we building wealth for the next generation? We are, it happens on the family level. I love this idea of like building an army of financial advisors, Black and brown financial advisors that are deeply steeped in the cultural relevancy of things like supporting family members and reaching back, and what it means to be a part of the sandwich generation where you're taking care of your aging parents while also raising your young kids at the same time and making your paycheck stretch as far as you can. But I also think that in addition to the systemic barriers, I think there's a ton of tools at our disposal that I'm really excited about. So thinking about from short and medium and long term, how can we build wealth from things like insurance policies, maxing out our 401ks, understanding the tax code. My fiance works for the IRS. I know, he's amazing, I promise. But really thinking about how do we actually leverage the tax code in our favor. Planning for exits and liquidity events at the startups that we're working with and the tax implications of all of that. These are all things that we do have access to right now that we should be thinking about in terms of our wealth building. And that's just a picture of my financial advisor, Randall, who is my homie, and there's many of him like that out in the world, and there's a ton of amazing resources and organizations that are hell-bent on making sure that we're thinking about wealth building.
So contact Lauryn for Randall's number, and let's blow up Randall.
Yes. Shout out to Randall.
The last one we have here is the state of health equities. Unfortunately, healthcare is a compounding tax of inequities. So it hits your wallet, it hits your just overall well-being. And what we find is that 50% of BIPOC Americans not only say they've received poor quality healthcare in the last 12 months, but they've also received discrimination from medical community by their race or ethnicity. And the other challenging part of this slide is that we see Black Americans especially are losing access because of the inflationary times that we're in to healthcare. You see 28% are unable to afford healthcare. That's 12% more than white Americans, and 22% are just unable to access it. They've lost access to it. And that has obviously long-term implications for communities and health, like lifestyles and health for years to come. We did want to highlight that Black women specifically report being gaslit at the doctor's office. This is our data with the SCIM State of Women report. 60% of Black women have been dismissed or misdiagnosed by a medical professional. 56% say that the doctor did not believe them when they told them what was happening. And then you get 81% then saying, I am my only advocate and I'm sitting on my own island, which is not a place, and that is not a fair place for Black women to reside when they're talking about their health care needs. Last thing here is the future of hope, where BIPOC Americans, much more likely than white Americans, are reorientating their priorities and their sense of well-being. So they're much more likely than white Americans, for example, to look at personal joy, to take control of their life, to look at their financial wellness and literacy, to build up their communities, to do continued learning. Just all of the things that actually academics tell us that builds a resilient, healthy life, BIPOC Americans are doing. They're also more likely to be selecting boundaries on their time and participating in rest culture. Yes. Can you talk to us about this?
Let's talk about the NAP ministry, y'all, okay? Yeah. I just want to say how subversive and political us finding our rest is. This is one of the sections that is absolutely a huge systemic problem. Doctors need to listen to us more. I can't think of one Black woman in my life who hasn't been gaslit at the doctor's office in one way, shape, or another, including myself. But this is a wonderful place to kind of honor and respect the people who are making these incredible safe spaces in the midst of all this systemic harm and trauma. I love the NAP ministry. I'm a proud member, whatever that means. I think that means that I just take naps at 3 o'clock every day. Therapy for Black girls is how I found my amazing Black woman therapist out in LA. My sister found her doula through the National Black Doula Association. We're really excited for that. And people are just reclaiming their space and time, and they're doing so in a way that combats, this constant kind of madness that's happening at the systemic level. And then the last thing I'll also say is I'm so impressed by how folks are carving out spaces that have traditionally just been completely non-accessible to us. So I just came back from the south of France last week at the Festival of Creativity, and Black folks were everywhere because we demanded that there be space there. We brought an Inkwell Beach from Martha's Vineyard to Cannes. Folks like Broccoli City and Black Joy Parade, which are unapologetically celebrating our culture, celebrating our joy, and making a big deal about that. And I think that's so important. So this was a, you know, there's a ton of work that still has to happen at the systemic level. We're working with our healthcare organizations to help them understand why this is so important. But I did want to just celebrate folks who are, you know, making it happen in the midst of all of that.
Absolutely. And then we have just a couple seconds left with you when I tell you what are the actions that BIPOC Americans are doing distinctly over white Americans. And that is they're teaching their children about systemic racism, they're voting for BIPOC candidates or candidates with BIPOC interests, and they're also not shopping with brands that do any disservice to them. So we didn't want to leave just on that note. We wanted to leave with one final thought of inspiration.
Yes, from the illustrious Angela Davis. She says, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. So that is our message to you, and thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you.